Welcome to Innovation Leadership. I'm Jess Larson, back with another episode of our mini-series, Longevity for Investors, where we talk about both how to live longer and how to make money from the incredible upside that the longevity business in biotech is about to create. Super excited to have my co-host here, Greg Bailey, well-known biotech investor, doctor with some very large exits. And Greg, why don't you introduce our great guest this week?
I had the pleasure of meeting Alex at an event in Gstaad, Switzerland. We probably crossed paths even before that. He's the new guard. I'm the old guard coming into longevity. And excited, as Jess says, to speak to him and get his perspective on the various projects he's working on and the breadth of the opportunities that he's seeing. Back to you, Jess.
Um, Alex, when you think about the future here, can you talk about maybe how some of the experiences of your career so far have helped shape the way that you're looking at the future?
And your background, Alex, how you got to where you are.
Yeah, absolutely. Great question. So my background, I kind of had like the 8-year-old kid moment of kind of watching people age around me. I grew up in the state of Maine, which is the oldest state in the country in the US by median age of the population. And kind of everywhere around you, you see the effects of aging. You see your neighbors get Alzheimer's disease, or your friends or family get cancer, and kind of you have that kid moment of asking people, what the heck is this? And people kind of just give you the answer of, this is life. Nothing we can do about it. It's the worst. It's awful. Everybody knows it's awful, but it's life. And just kind of knowing as a kid, projecting into the future that, at some point it's not going to be like this. And at some point we're going to innovate ourselves to a way that we can age healthier longer. And I think that was my driving experience of just knowing this was a field that was one of the most impactful and kind of largest markets of anything we could possibly do. And so that was me as an 8-year-old, and it eventually led me to, in undergrad, start working in David Sinclair's lab at Harvard, which was my first taste of kind of the academic fields of the biology of aging and the academic side of longevity, which had been around for probably about 30 years at that point, and went from there to working in management consulting for biopharma to kind of learn the trades of commercialization and clinical trial design, and then took it from there to do a PhD in Tom Rando's lab at Stanford. And that was when, of course, I went headfirst all in terms of diving into the kind of basic academic research side of the longevity field, and was very lucky at about that time to meet my now co-founder, Laura Deming, during my first year of grad school. And she exposed me to all the magical world that biotech venture capital is and what's possible in that space. And I had a blast over the years of my PhD getting to help her out on the side. That eventually turned into running 3 different family offices in terms of their investing into the longevity space. The last of which a stop called the Amaranth Foundation, which is a family office focused on funding moonshots in the space. Deployed about 100 million into the space out of that family office, and about a year ago joined Laura to build out Age One, which is the next version of the longevity fund, a project she's been working on for about a decade now. So longevity biotech VC. So all this to say, ever since 8, I've kind of known that this was one of the most impactful things human could possibly be working on. And finally, as of the past couple of years, we're really starting to see some hints that promise of that huge potential is kind of coming into reality, which has been really cool to see.
How old are you?
That's
Sounds like 3 decades.
It is exactly 3 decades. I'm 30 years old.
Alex, I'm interested. What do you feel like is one of the biggest takeaways from deploying that 100 million with the family office?
Yeah, really, really good question. And I think like one of the biggest takeaways was, like in essence, like how easy it is to make impact. I think it, like, seemingly on the surface of the field, you could be like, oh, I see headlines all the time about billionaires funding the aging field, and therefore, there's no potential counterfactual impact or, potential impact from making investments in the field. And that is just like entirely not true. Like you can help, in essence, make efforts happen with very little amounts of money. And I think that was like a surprising takeaway at the time. It like really doesn't take that much money to, invest in a founder and give them that self-belief and have them go on and be able to build something, beyond your wildest dreams just because you were willing to kind of take a risk on them. So that was one takeaway. And then I think another takeaway is that like I don't really know if like true impact investing really works in the aging field. I think like having the kind of standard biotech VC or like maybe not the standard biotech VC, but like in essence having a kind of like returns oriented venture and kind of like for profit capitalism first venture is actually pretty important to like long term success because ultimately like very rarely can one family office be a sole funder of a venture. So you really have to think in the lens of like, how can this company truly be the best for-profit company possible to attract late-stage capital to kind of get through, if we're talking about biotech clinical trials that the company needs to get through. So those are probably the two things. Like one, bigger impact than you could possibly imagine. But two, like impact investing in its own right usually doesn't work. The so-called catalytic capital.
That's such an interesting insight. Greg, I know this is generating questions for you. I didn't take the next few.
Yeah, I think that's very, very important. When I think about financings in biotech and I'm doing my financing, I'm not thinking about that round. I'm thinking about what the next round's going to be. How do I position this to get the next round of financing? It has to be sustainable, and it has to be one where you're going to continue to get great more additional financing because this is a long-term play. Which has been your greatest success doing that?
Yeah, really, really good question. I think one of the coolest successes has been Loyal, the company working on dog longevity, where in essence, like at the very beginning, so this is a founder, Celine, who in essence started coming to San Francisco. I want to say it was about like 2018, 2019, probably 2018-ish. And I was lucky to meet her on one of her first weekends in San Francisco. And she came in essence to visit with Laura, started co-working with Laura, eventually became Laura's chief of staff at the Longevity Fund for about a year. And it was kind of during that time when Celine and was kind of starting to incubate and get a little bit closer to the idea that her company Loyal is working on today, which eventually became this concept of dog longevity. So Celine was very frustrated that a lot of the companies in the aging field weren't targeting longevity itself as the endpoint. In essence, one of the big promises of the geroscience field or the longevity field is to try to get drugs approved for aging, approved and labeled for aging, as opposed for specific diseases. And so Celine kind of eventually came up with this crazy idea of being at the intersection of two of her loves, one of which was longevity field and trying to get a longevity drug, a drug approved for longevity, and the other was veterinary medicine and her just absolute love for animals, including dogs, and kind of eventually came across this intersection of I'm going to build a company that is trying to extend dog lifespan and get that approved by the FDA or the dog subset of the FDA, the Center for Veterinary Medicine. And at the time, I think it was like a very shocking idea, uh, a very shocking concept that was actually really hard to believe at the time of like late stage capital would be possible to come into this idea. But Celine as a founder was just like so powerful and kind of a force of nature, founder that, you kind of believed at the time she could make almost anything happen. And so I'd say like Loyal was an example of like, truly getting convinced that this was something based on the market sizes involved, which are like billions of dollars in dogs alone. That just Celine herself was capable of getting that late stage funding. And
Can you walk us
flash
through
forward
that
a couple
financing,
of years.
Alex? When did the first investments come in? What was the escalation? Because our audience, we're trying to empower them to go and invest. So she found her passion. That's a huge thing to me, that you need a passionate entrepreneur behind it. with the background, significant background, and then money went in. Has there been multiple rounds of financing? Is it accretive to an investor? And then Jess, you probably got a couple of questions to follow that.
Yeah, absolutely. Really, really good question. So Laura out of the longevity fund was kind of Celine's first money in. And that was back in, I think, 2019, I believe. Um, Celine went through Laura's kind of like age one accelerator program, which was the inspiration for our new fund. So in essence, was putting like $500,000, I think it was, into Loyal at the time. Celine went on from that to raise a little over a $5 million seed round. I want to say only, 5 or 6 months later after that. After that, subsequently went on to raise a Series A, and has also raised kind of a number of safes in between. And right now, Loyal's at well over $60 million raised, which has been able to get them to the point of just 5 months ago, getting the FDA to give them an early green light for efficacy, for an accelerated approval for what's called reasonable expectation of efficacy, for their first of three drugs. So $60 million plus for dog longevity and dog aging, which I think, yeah, it goes back to that anecdote of bet on founders that will run through walls and have the ability to raise money from anybody. It all kind of comes down to the people, in terms of who's capable of raising that late stage capital.
What's the valuation? And then over to you, Jess.
Yeah, really good question. I'm not sure what the valuation was for that Series A off the top of my head, but I can tell you from like Laura's initial money that she put in, it's well over a 20x.
That's incredible. Um, Alex, can you talk about, you know, Greg and I, part of this series is to help biotech and specifically longevity biotech feel like less of a black box. So often we get advice. You take a quote from Warren Buffett about, don't invest in things you don't understand, right? And yet, when you look at, 99% of the holdings of public companies that any of us have, there are elements of those businesses that we couldn't do ourselves and that we don't understand, right? Certainly, there's like, I don't actually have to be an AI researcher, PhD myself to recognize and to do due diligence on who is doing well in AI if I wanted to be an investor in AI. And yet, I think of myself in the past. I think about a lot of my friends, and biotech, it's almost been labeled as scary or things like this in the past. When you think about helping to get your maybe intelligent, high net worth individual made money in a different field, to help them become comfortable with what they can know, what they don't need to know, and how to trust somebody like you guys at age one to invest with. What's your process, or when you're not talking to another PhD, how do you help them get a sense of comfort knowing that they're not going to know everything?
Yeah, really, really good question, Jess. I think that like one of the first questions that I get from a lot of people is about timelines. I think people are very scared in biotech and in longevity biotech in particular, where you're targeting aging, that kind of timelines to potential exits are way beyond a standard 10-year life cycle of a fund. And so I think that actually, which is pretty cool, we definitively have the data that is not true. We've seen in our own hands. Yeah, it's your standard venture investing timeline. I mean, Laura from the longevity fund, out of her first fund, returned the fund in about 6.5 years. And was way beyond returning the fund just a year after that. So it's, we're talking about very standard venture timelines here that are no different from, any other field of venture. I mean, there's maybe one exception, which is crypto, depending on the direction of the markets in terms of times to exit. But beyond that, it's, same as any other tech or deep tech field, is what I'd say. And Greg is another amazing example of someone who's been able to experience really significant exits on shorter timelines. And I think probably my advice to people is usually to go invest with really smart VC funds, right? I think this is a great way to get exposure to the longevity biotech people if people maybe are a little bit hesitant themselves to dive in initially, right? There's kind of a great strategy of partner with really great funds or great investors, kind of have them lead, learn over a couple of year period, and kind of gain more comfort and build out a portfolio from there. I think that's a great strategy, no matter the industry, if it's not one that you have a ton of investing experience before. But there's certainly no reason to treat longevity biotech different from any other field of investing.
Yeah. And I know I didn't cover it in the beginning, but for anybody who didn't catch my previous episodes, um, Greg has had some big successes, specifically selling top migraine drug to Pfizer for 11.6 billion, top prostate cancer drug to Pfizer for 14 billion. Still has Biohaven that I think last week had a market cap of 4.5 billion, as well as other successes. So, Alex, kind of doubling down on this, when you're in an actual meeting with an LP, somebody who's thinking about, like they're thinking about going with you guys, if for some reason they weren't going to go with Age One, or they were considering supporting other venture capital GPs in the longevity biotech space besides yourself, what kind of questions would you ask an investor, whose background is outside the industry? Say, hey, if you're making other investments with other GPs, like here's the kind of questions you need to ask to get a sense of if these are the kind of people that you want, spreading the risk for you across a fund.
Yeah, really, really good question. I think one of the things that I'd ask is like ask for written communication. This is something I've started doing with founders actually, which has been really helpful. Is like founders who send you regular written updates without asking, uh, in my experience, tend to be correlated with better outcomes. And I think probably the same is true with venture capitalists as well. There's something weird about that as just kind of having very positive signal. So I'd say ask for written updates, and it kind of really helps you understand the evolution of things over time from the fund. I'd say ask for investment memos, because ultimately what you're really kind of trying to get a sense of is a VC's judgment. You really want to understand their judgment and their decision making. Ultimately, you're making a huge bet on a couple of things. One, like how good is a VC's judgment? How good are they at picking? Two, kind of what their sourcing or deal flow looks like. Um, and I think sourcing deal flow usually would be like a little bit more apparent, but I think judgment is the part that is maybe a little bit of a trickier part to assess if you're coming new into a space. And I think that's where things like investment memos and written updates can be really useful. And then I'd say maybe like the third thing beyond that is like just the standard reference checks. I mean, like some LPs do them, but a shocking percent do not. And I think reference checks of both references provided by a venture capital fund and also back channeling of all the folks around them, founders in their portfolio, et cetera, can be extremely useful.
That's great. Greg, I'm going to hand it back to you. What are you thinking about here?
It is astonishing to me. A few people check references, and go back a few years, and you're like, you really didn't see this guy Bernie Madoff? You didn't like call anybody on this one? It is remarkable. Alex, viewing audience, or listening audience and viewing audience, if you were telling them, from your experience, what do they look for? So somebody comes and says to them, hey, you need to look at this project. It's a really exciting biotech project. What would you say? What are the 6 things that they should do before making the investment? What are the major ones that you use personally? And think I'm going to invest because I see these qualities, these boxes checked.
Gotcha. So you're saying like me as a GP evaluating a new investment, like what do I do in essence if it's something that I'm like, I'm feeling strong about it, but here's what I need to do. Here's the boxes to check before we actually deploy money. Yeah. So in that case, like in essence, I think like one of the first things I do is I like to spend a little bit more extended time with the founder. So if I have the ability, which sometimes you just don't, I like to go on something like a walk or a hike, with a founder. And, sometimes it'll even be like a 3 hour walk. I remember there was one founder in Boston. I took like a 3 hour walk with them starting at like 10 p.m. or it was like something crazy, but it was like, I think it's kind of these
I hope it was the
situations. If you
summer and
like go
not
on
the
a hike
winter in
with somebody, you
Boston
can
there, Alex.
really,
I hope it was the summer, not the winter.
yeah. I, I think it was. I think it was summer. Oh God, but that would be the ultimate test. Yeah, the test of commitment. You want a founder who's willing to run through anything. Run through 3 feet of snow in the winter in Boston. Uh, yeah, yeah. I think that like a hike can be super informative, or a long walk can be super informative in terms of like getting to know a founder beyond the pitch. Right. I think like it's very easy on Zoom to really get founders in kind of like pitch mode, and it can be hard to like truly actually feel like you can understand them a bit more, catch them in an area maybe where their guard is down a little bit more to kind of really get more personal and kind of to the heart of emotional things is what I'd say. And so that's one of the kind of first things that I'll do if I kind of get the sense that we're really moving to kind of like a kind of negotiation or term sheet discussion or something like that. I think another step beyond that is, on the subject of reference checks, usually we'll ask founders for, a couple people that they've managed, a couple people that have been at an equivalent level to them at previous companies, and a couple of people that have been their boss. And we'll go down that list. And then I'll also ask, is it okay if I back channel references beyond that? We'll usually go do that with, at least a couple of people, sometimes a lot more, depending on the things that we've identified. And then from there, we'll usually ask a founder, like, kind of, is there like 3 experts in your field that you can introduce me to that could help assess, the quality of what you're working on or like what you're trying to do? And I think the interesting thing for listeners to note here is that, none of the things that I've mentioned here require extensive domain expertise. Diligence is almost more of a function of can you, put the effort in to get the right people on the phone and really pick their brain about a new founder or a new idea. Um, more so than any other, technical, I already had this technical background experience, which I think is pretty interesting. It's literally just like, can you go and get these, amazing MDs and PhDs and professors and postdocs on the phone to kind of diligence this founder's idea because, no one's a technical expert in every single one of the subfields that we invest in. And so that's kind of the second thing I do. And then the third thing after that is kind of like putting everything together in an investment memo, which I think the writing part is super valuable to truly, one, you like check your own internal boxes of things like market and competitive landscape and, what's missing, what gaps exist on the science side. And you just learn so much through the process of writing of like the things that you took for granted, like what qualities about a founder that you truly value, et cetera. And then I think, after those 3 things, I think it's really kind of like off to the races in terms of getting a term sheet done, agreeing to deal and rock and roll from there.
I like the rock and roll. Um, I think that's really important. Is the exactly what you said. This is about the people, and it doesn't matter whether it's biotech or AI. It's can this person deliver? Are they passionate? Will they run through a wall? I know, Jess, you're about to put together a fund to invest in biotech and longevity. Which of these elements resonated with you as far as what Alex has said?
No, I mean, it certainly gives me comfort, Alex, when you say that I don't need to go to Stanford for 6 years and become a PhD to be allowed into the field, right? Um, but this idea of reference checks, and where people are so often willing to, give the references who are going to give them a good reference. I'm super happy to hear about your back channel referencing as well. I guess my question is, I just finished that book on venture power laws. I don't know if you've seen that one out there, but it's great. And for me, it highlighted so much. I'm such a nerd for the 80-20 principle or, Pareto distribution, right? And you look at the power laws in venture and maybe almost more so in biotech. Um, my question is, so often these people doing these founders leading moonshot opportunities they're not like the most socially acceptable, or there can be friction, or they have very, very strong personalities, right? And so my question is, I'm super excited that you guys are doing moonshot things. It makes me feel like the whole space is going to move forward when there's people like you who have the guts to do the things that might really move the needle. But my question for you is, when you meet this potentially very intense founder who's willing to run through walls or take a 3-hour walk in Boston in the winter, right? How do you separate out the arrogant people who sound good versus maybe the higher friction people who are good?
Yeah, that's all right. Yeah, I think that's in part why I like the like hike walk sort of setup is because you really like cut past the like sound good part and you can really kind of cut to like the core of their judgment and their beliefs. But you make a really good point that I should have flagged in when talking about doing all these reference checks is that you're entirely correct. I mean, we've invested in founders out of this new fund that I heard from people, they are, they are rough around the edges or something about them being a little bit off-putting in lab because they were like too competitive about something or something of this nature. I would say like we've heard it all in terms of these kind of run through walls founders and the frictions that are created around that. So agreed, like just because you hear about some friction or that somebody doesn't like somebody, like that is certainly not a signal not to invest. Like you're not looking to invest in likable founders, right? Or I mean, like that shouldn't be your number one criteria. It's just that every reference check you talk to says amazing things about a person, right? But I still think they're absolutely key to like truly understand what those friction points are for people. Sometimes, I mean, in particular, actually, we've seen it like solo founders. Tend to be a little bit more disagreeable on this access, which is actually why it's a great thing that like, solar founders is a phenomenon that can exist and work really, really well. I mean, we've seen it with Elon Musk, right? Like there's just some personalities that are more suited to, them having full control of a company to not have to worry about co-founder conflict, right? And so I think you have to like when you meet a founder and they're thinking about getting co-founders, that's actually something I think about a little bit is, there are just some people more amenable to being a solo founder who, they're independent spirits. And that can be, one of the most powerful things. But yeah, you make a really good point in that during reference checks, you will hear a lot of things, some good, some got bad. And I think for the bad, it's really sussing out, is this a problem for a company, right? There are some bad things you hear. And honestly, I've heard like very overtly bad things from reference checks that people have provided. So not even back channeling, but I've heard people's references be like no on this access they're just not cut out to be a founder, and that's super informative. So yeah, you kind of hear the gamut of all information, and it is a little bit of an art to tease through exactly what is a problem for you versus what isn't. But agreed that just ruffling some feathers it comes with the territory, and you can't be too concerned about that one.
But it makes me think about that quote. Do you remember the Benedict Cumberbatch movie about Alan Turing called Imitation Game? About cracking during World War II when the guy who cracked the Enigma, the Nazis' codes. Anyways, there's this quote in there from his coworkers, arguably created the first computer. Okay. And they said, to be an irascible genius, you actually have to be a genius, because at that point he was just irascible, right? Um, so, Greg, I know we're interviewing Alex here, but I want to ask you the same question you asked him. When you are like, nobody can be an expert at everything. When you're looking at the investments you've made in biotech over the last 20, 30 years, what are some of the go-to things that have really served you well?
Something that Alex said, and I firmly believe, is you don't need an MD and PhD to invest in biotech and longevity. And there's a gentleman, Alex Pickett, who works with me. And Alex, when we would look at things, would like immerse himself trying to get a PhD in whatever pathway that the company had. And I'm like, Alex, you're never going to catch up. There's somebody who spent 10, 15, 20 years of their life doing that. So let's get that expert. So exactly what Alex said, asking the founder or the entrepreneur, the CEO, and saying, what three people would you recommend who you think understand your sector best? And then because people often pick people who are going to say something very positive about that opportunity, you then ask them to recommend a couple more people, and suddenly you're getting outside of the people that the CEO recommended and getting a disparate perspective, which is what you're obviously looking for. So I don't need to have an MD, PhD. I don't need to understand that sector. I simply have to know who to ask, get the right question would be my response.
Oh, I love that answer. Well, maybe I'll ask one more and hand it back to you, Greg. Um, Alex, can you talk about having the guts to make moonshot investments where you're literally going to investors saying, hey, the probabilities are that we need to make more than one of these because some of these are going to fail? Can you talk about that?
Yeah, I think like it's something that can be like a little bit unsettling initially. But I think with like a little bit of time and exposure, you do really realize, kind of as you mentioned, we're talking about this bell curve of returns. And, if you're investing in, the standard or the average or the trend at the time, you're not going to experience those kind of like outsized returns over a long time period. And so like at some point your brain will like physically switch to the point of actually like you encounter something that you invest in, especially referring, I should clarify for people, explicitly referring to earliest stage investing. So pre-seed and seed, very different if we're talking about late stage investing, things headed through clinical trials or headed towards public markets or something like that. Totally different ballgame. But if we're talking about pre-seed or seed investing, you really have to kind of try to squint and extrapolate a little bit as to, 5, 6 years from now, is this going to be a really exciting and new technology, right? Because what is, maybe a little bit exciting now, 6 years from now will suddenly be, a little bit obsolete to some extent. And so if you're not investing in moonshots or things that seem a little bit crazy, then you don't even have the chance to have things that, 7 to 10 years from now are the new cutting edge thing that big pharma and the rest of the field is really excited about making a big impact to the field. So I think when you realize that, you kind of switch to, oh, wow, it's actually way more risky at a pre-seed level to invest in things that seem really conservative. Even though on the surface, it's like very counterintuitive.
What have you seen that is the wow? What's like boggling your mind? Can't believe this is coming.
Yeah, yeah. I'd say like what is boggling my mind right now is this kind of subfield of uh, the incorrect term to use, but the pop culture term is synthetic embryos. I think another term for it is integrated stem cell models. But I think this is one of the wow fields that was really only possible in the past 2 years. And for the listeners out there that may be kind of new to this concept or new to the science, in essence, what I'm referring to is the ability to create an embryo that is derived not from egg and sperm, but instead from embryonic stem cells. So in essence, it's the ability to create an embryo from not germ cells, which is just a very mind-boggling concept. We've seen a number of Nature papers over the past year from several top labs, including from Israel and from Caltech and from others that have shown the ability to, in essence, culture these synthetic embryos or integrated stem cell models out to, even like 2 weeks old, both in mice and in humans. And there's suddenly been a new wave of companies that have come along that are focused on how can we take these integrated stem cell models that have this ability to grow up for several weeks in culture, and how can we, in essence, harvest these embryos for cells for use in cell therapy in humans, whether that's for hematopoietic stem cells or for eventually it'll be the ability to generate egg cells for potential treatments for fertility. So I think this is an area that has been, mind blowing to me. It wasn't really on my radar 2 years ago. And suddenly, there's a number of companies doing this. It is, in a sense, riding the line between dystopia and utopia. And I think a lot of people haven't fully conceptualized what it means yet. Ethicists are still really trying to figure out what to do with it in terms of the ethics behind growing these embryos and using them, in essence, blending them up and using them for tissue in humans. But it's also one of the most remarkable things we could imagine in terms of the ability to truly get genetically identical to yourself, young tissue, right? No immunosuppression needed. So that's been blowing my mind.
Yeah, I mean, literally, you could use it to create a kidney, instead of having to do a kidney transplant, take it to the point of that. Actually growing a fetus. I mean, like, because I guess it was probably a year ago, I got called by the Israeli company and said, we've taken a cell and turned it into a human fetus. And you're like, wow. And I think they were going to be allowed to take it past 2 weeks, which, again, morally, ethically extraordinary. So science fiction is becoming science, which is part of what is exciting to all of us in this area. I think that from, again, our audience perspective, when you do this and one of these things come to fruition, and if it's the utopian side of what Alex has just described, it's so powerful to how you are literally changing humanity in it, and hopefully, if it's used properly, for wonderful reasons. So I've got to imagine, Jess, you've got questions feeding off of that example that Alex has just given us. So I'll turn it back to you.
Well, my question is this, and it goes back to the power laws, right? You look at, I mean, obviously there's lots of famous overestimates of industries, but like when you see numbers come out, like people saying, hey, we think that this is potentially $1 trillion a year in revenue kind of business. When you have an industry like that starts trading on the stock market, the idea of this being like a $20 trillion market cap type of industry, like, these estimates, it sounds so crazy, all of a sudden go like, wow, could that actually be possible? In your mind, Alex, what do you think will be needed from venture these days to help these founders, scientists, drug developers to get from hype to reality?
Yeah, it's in part Greg, so we should absolutely send him to the lab for cloning. I think more people.
Actually, I want to talk about that for 1 second.
That would be
when
frightening.
You think,
There's so many people on so many levels.
So obviously, I have huge respect for Greg and being the chairman over at Juvenescence. If anybody doesn't know Juvenescence, you should check that out. But I'm interested, Alec, let's do a little due diligence on Greg for 1 minute. If I was calling you saying, hey, what about this Greg Bailey guy? Is he somebody that I should maybe look at working with, or should I stay away?
You know where you live, Alex. Be careful what you say.
What would you tell me?
Yeah, I mean, what I would tell you is that he's like an absolute unicorn, right? I mean, like the whole thing with the longevity field is that there's like so few people who truly have this kind of mix of the operational excellence of, having the ability to be there and done that in terms of getting drugs, over the finish line of working with big pharma and like truly getting to that point of seeing the process all the way through, right? So few humans have just like already had that skill, and then overlay that in terms of truly, understanding the longevity landscape and having a deep background in that. It's like we're lucky to have a unicorn sighting on this podcast today, which is very rare. I'd say that like, he is the exact person that you would want any new founder in this space to kind of have kind of on their cap table as an advisor. I'd say that like, like sometimes it's good for newer technologies to have the like young naive founder who like doesn't have all the scars, and so they can actually so they'll actually go and do things that some of the people with scars won't do because they've learned the hard way. And sometimes that can be useful for the space as a whole because sometimes people will be just so naive that they'll do something that, most sane people wouldn't do. And sometimes that'll end out really, really good. But I'd say like the exact person that all these people could use on their cap table is Greg. So yeah, it's somebody with.
I love it. Now that we've embarrassed Greg enough, now it's your turn. When you think about how many people would love to have risen to the level of deploying $100 million of venture in such an exciting space and partner with such a pioneer like your partner there at age one. What do you think's different about you? What do you think you've done that others haven't done?
Yeah, I mean, a little bit is I just like was lucky to have Laura as a mentor. I think like it took her about 3 years during my PhD to drill me, probably like once a month or once every other week, as to why I was doing things a certain way. I was like totally lining myself up at certain points in my PhD to go and be an associate at like a Third Rock Ventures or some sort of similar equivalent like biotech venture capital firm. Because I always wanted, like, longevity was my passion, right? But I was just so convinced that I needed to go and take that route in order to be able to gain the full skill set to be able to then go back to the longevity field, 10, 15 years down the road once I had all that experience in traditional biotech. And it really took Laura just kind of like over 3 years convincing me that the best thing I could do was go directly to the problem that I cared about most and directly challenge my assumptions, just dive into the thing that I think had the potential for the highest impact and where I should be spending my time. And that was unbelievably valuable. So, one thing I just like had Laura telling me to like go do the direct thing. And then I'd say the other thing is, I'm just a very determined person. I think I embody the run through walls mentality. Operationally, I am far from excellent. Operational skills are weak. Luckily, I like know that, and so I know how to pair myself with people who have those. But I've got the like I will, stick at something if I am very, very high confidence that it is something worth doing, even if surrounding environment is a bit doom and gloom. And then I think the third thing is I've just been pretty lucky to be at the intersection of a lot of cool fields. I think being at the intersection of background experiences can be really valuable. And so I think the combo of doing like management consulting for big pharma before a PhD has been extremely valuable for me in terms of being able to kind of sit at the intersection of things and then also just kind of like live through the history of longevity fund as well.
Well, I'm super impressed with you. I'm not surprised that Laura wanted you as a partner, and I'm super glad you were willing to come on the show. Greg, why don't you end us off with the final question here?
Yeah, this has been fantastic, as Jess has said, Alex, and thank you for taking the time. And how much money do we need in this sector to reach the promised land of seeing extraordinary therapeutic agents? Is it $1 trillion or is it a bunch of other $100 million funds?
Yeah, I think, and one thing I'll note, I mean, you guys were talking about market size. We did a blog post about, I think, 3 months ago now, 4 months ago now, where we did, in essence, like a market size analysis of the first approved aging drug. The first drug labeled and approved for longevity. And I think this might be useful intel for the listeners, which is, in essence, we found in our analysis that it would be about 150 billion to 200 billion dollar per year drug. So we're talking about annual, revenue of 200 million, 200 billion, excuse me, with a B. And this is just like a very, crazy, crazy kind of phenomenon that very few people have baked into their calculus of what's possible in this field. And that this would be, 3 to 4 times bigger drug than the GLP-1 receptor agonist class right now. So this is your Ozempic, your Wegovy, your semaglutide. We're talking 3 to 4x that. And for anybody who's been, looking at the headlines recently, GLP-1s are the biggest story in medicine over the past couple of years. And so, we said in this analysis, if a company just had this one drug, which was this drug approved and labeled for aging, they would be more valuable than the top two big pharma companies in the world, combined. So I think few people have had like truly baked into like what this means. And then, you add that to the fact that there have been so little shots on net to actually achieve that, biggest market size in biotech history. It's a pretty cool time to be investing in this space. But in terms of the money that it takes, I think it's probably somewhere in between those answers, right? If you're taking me, if you're asking me what it would take to give, all humans, 30 to 40 extra years of healthy life, I would bias towards the trillion number. If your, question is what it'll take to get that first drug approved, I think probably just a couple more $100 million funds. And I think having those funds be able to unlock the insane amounts of capital that exist in other kind of investment pools all around the world, whether that's sovereign wealth funds or late stage crossover biotech funds. I think there's so much money already out there, and the role of some really talented funds and really talented entrepreneurs like Greg can in essence take a small amount of resources and unlock a very large amount of resources to kind of blaze this trail.
I am so happy to hear you say that because I tell people to put 1% of your net worth into this, not crazy, because if you're, and I fully subscribe to that number, it'll be 150 to 200 billion a year. That company will be worth over $2 trillion. So if you are even marginally right, the returns are mind-boggling. And the other thing is, you've actually increased and optimized the human experience. I mean, how fantastic would that be? Jess, say goodbye for us and finish us off.
Well, this is just so great, Alex. If people want to follow you, are you on LinkedIn? If people want to read that blog post, do you want to give us the website? And what else do you want to leave people with today?
Yeah, absolutely. And cannot thank both of you enough for having me on. Thank you so much, Jess. This has been fantastic. You two are rock stars. I'd say in terms of our blog post, you can find it at age1.com. Yeah, it's on my shirt, I guess. And I'm on Twitter at Alex J Colville not .com at Twitter at X. And then also on LinkedIn, Alex Colville. But yeah, I cannot thank both of you for having me on. This has been a blast.
No, it's been so great for us. Thank you for making time. Okay, bye everyone.